And for more insights, we're joined by Eyal Mayroz, Senior Lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayroz, for joining us. So these talks with the U.S., Iran talks with the U.S., it might begin in Pakistan tomorrow. But given the complete distrust from Iran, how likely will this affect talks?
Look, good afternoon. I think the distrust or the mistrust is indeed there, but beyond that, I think both sides are arriving at these negotiations with huge gaps in their interest and in their needs. And so the chances of a very successful round is certainly in 2 weeks are not looking too positive. I think they will be struggling to make good use of those negotiations, and mainly because both sides have a very strong interest in ending the war. But at the same time, both sides are very reluctant to give up some of their demands, which are clashing very strongly with one another.
Right. So saying that, are we looking at, the talks being conflict management or perhaps conflict resolution? It sounds more like it's a conflict management. And if that is the case, then what's the most plausible outcomes here? Are we looking at temporary de-escalation? Are we looking at frozen conflict or, a comprehensive agreement? Will we even see a deal of sorts?
I think the so-called 10 points plan or demands by the Iranians, if indeed true, will then project very pessimistically on the outcomes. But I think what everyone is missing at the moment is a clear view of what is happening domestically within the power structures in Iran. At the moment, it looks like the hardliners are in control, but how much in control are they, and what is there, if any, opposition within Iran leadership to this hard line? I think in terms of the American demands, there are certain points made by the Iranians that the Americans may agree to, but there are certainly others that they will not. So I think a lot depends on these unclear dynamics within both sides, and especially on the Iranian side.
Exactly, Mr. Mayroz. Speaking of these uncertainty, there are certainly challenges with talks and ceasefire going forward. But what would you say are the key ones that need to be addressed immediately here?
As I said, I think because both sides want the end of the war, then one question is certainly around Israel and Lebanon. How strong are the Iranians in their demand for end of fighting there? How much leverage will the Americans have over Israel in forcing Israel to stop? Because at the moment, Israel doesn't seem to want to. Obviously, the reparation demand by the Iranians is not going to be seen favorably in Washington. And the question of the uranium, the enriched uranium, is also very critical. The Americans may, in some situation, agree to low-level continued enrichment for so-called civilian purposes, but the future of those 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium is something that the Americans would struggle to agree to. So again, these are very, very difficult challenges that both sides will have to negotiate. I don't think they'll have a problem extending the talks, the 2 weeks ceasefire, if it does last, and I'm not sure it will, because that could be easily arranged. But then how far will they go, and what will be the outcomes, especially in the case of the Hormuz Strait, which does not directly impact the Americans, but it does on the Bowser and in terms of domestic politics. And so that will be the challenge for Trump, seeing the elections in the coming fall.
Right. I do want to talk about the Strait of Hormuz, but first I want to speak about Pakistan here. What are the advantages of having a third party mediate the talks? Because it is going to be held in Islamabad. And, how much of this is actually centered on Pakistan's own geopolitical interests here?
Look, I think it is very common for states or third-party states to offer their mediation services. And while maybe in the past the UN was doing a lot of that, in more recent years it's very common. Turkey, India, many countries have offered their services in the case of Ukraine and now in the case of Iran. I don't think that the country in question as a mediator has a huge impact. I think it's more to do with providing the arena, providing the conditions for the negotiations, but it remains mainly on the demands and the needs and the interests of the parties in question.
Mr. Mayroz, let's bring in the Strait of Hormuz here. And the report suggests that Iran, they may have laid sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz as leverage. How does that shape the balance of power heading into the fragile talks in Islamabad here then?
Look, I think, yes, there are reports of that. How many and how difficult will it be to, remove those is a question for the military analysts. But I think that as easy as it is for Iran to agree to opening the straits, it will not be very difficult for them to close it. And they've already signaled that they will, given Israel's continued attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I think it's more the question of Hormuz, including the opening of the Hormuz Strait, but also in terms of charging fees and a lot of money that they are planning for shipping containers, mainly with the oil and gas. This is going to be a tough sell, both for the Americans and for the international community, especially given that this is in defiance of international law to do something like that.
Right. So as these talks are happening, where do Gulf states stand as the conflict drags on? Bahrain is signaling frustration. Do you see any of them pushing back against the U.S. or shifting their support here?
Well, first of all, there's been a lot of reports of some of these Gulf states that are saying one thing publicly and another quietly, diplomatically to the U.S. But I think it's likely that different Gulf states have different interests and therefore different policies. They are, on one hand, very much afraid of a strong Iran, and therefore it's within their interest to try and, push for not ending the war unless there is some kind of a regime change, which, as all of us know, is not going to happen from the air. Maybe later on, once the war has ended, longer-term political domestic dynamics. But I think that certainly most of the Gulf states would want to see some return of normalcy, whether or not they will agree to it in return for strong Iranian presence in the Hormuz Straits and in more generally around the region. This is something that each state will have to negotiate, and it is unclear how far they will go.
All right, Mr. Mayroz, you mentioned the normalcy, exactly, which is what everybody wants. But what happens next if the ceasefire falls apart then?
That is for anyone who tries to decipher Trump's very unclear motivation. Often Trump is dissuaded by or persuaded by those around him, and how far will he go? He's clearly understanding that escalating the war is not within or not within the American interest, nor his politically. But will he have another option should the negotiations fall apart? It is unclear. I think both sides have an interest in prolonging negotiations and trying to avoid that escalation. But obviously there are situations where at some point, if nothing moves forward, they will have to make a decision on.
All right. Thank you so much for your analysis. I've been speaking with Eyal Mayroz, Senior Lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney.